Is on the Sahel region of West Africa, part of the continent that has been marred in violence, in terrorism activities, and Islamist insurgency, and the insecurity in the region seem to be growing more and more by the day. And the question we are asking today is who are the hidden faces behind this unending violence in the Sahel region of Africa, where we have had foreign troops come to help local governments fight this terrorist act in the region. But then we still see this act continuing by the day, and we are bound to ask the question: what needs to be done for this insecurity in the Sahel region to come to an end? What do the different countries in this part of the continent have to do to be able to quell this violence and insecurity that has taken hold of the region? And with us this day to discuss this very pertinent issue is Dr. Stanley FONGOD. He is a Pan-Africanist. Hello, sir, and thanks for honoring our invitation this day.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope we have a fruitful conversation today, and thanks and those who are logging in rather from around the world, that they will be able to enjoy the conversation as well.
Thank you very much. Of course, we are hoping that those who are watching us right now will be able to learn one or two things from what is happening in the Sahel region of West Africa. And just to remind our viewers that you can find us, we are streaming live on Facebook as well as YouTube. Just follow our page for You Media Africa, and you will be glued to the program live, be it from your offices or from your workplaces. So let's dive straight away into the subject matter of the day. We have been talking on this platform and other platforms of the different on the insecurity that has taken hold of the Sahel region of Africa, and we have seen foreign troops like troops from France, the United States, who have come to help fight this terrorism in the region. But then we still see the region in experiencing violence, experiencing insecurity. Now, what do you think are the underlying causes of insecurity in the Sahel region of West Africa, Dr. FONGOD?
Well, what we have in the Sahel, spanning from places like Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Chad, Mauritania, it's a buffet of things. It's a combination of a lot of factors. It's not just one. And we also will not just be looking at either, a political structure, a country, with foreign influence in the region. We are also looking at economic factors. We are looking at ethnic tensions. We are looking at a whole lot of issues that is happening within that region. And I also want us to understand fully that that region, some few years ago, was extremely quite stable. That region, maybe, within around the period of 2008 all the way down, that region experienced a little bit more stability. And prior to that, except that one guy called Barack Hussein Obama got into a place called Libya and then toppled Gaddafi. And as a result of that, mercenaries from those areas with AK-47s and weapons of war began invading sub-Saharan Africa with their own, fringe ideology of Islam, and so created the instability that we are having across the entire region. And this is Africa's story. So when you look at the places like the Sahel, what is going on in the Sahel, we have to absolutely understand its underlying causes. The root causes of this particular issue, is always instigated from the outside. And then because of the economic issues, the weak political structures that we have in these areas, it just amplifies whatever tensions already existed, within the different factions that we have, mostly along ethnic lines that we have, which is typically what happens on the African continent, is that most of our separations and our, infighting always takes place, within those ethnic structures. So we have to be able to understand that, in able to, give some kind of a rational thought as to what is absolutely happening within this region. I am not always big in trying to be able to basically point fingers at those who are in authority, especially on the African continent, because most likely those who are in authority, who are actually carrying out some of these operations, are puppets of nobody else but either the East or the West. As it is right now, the geopolitical landscape on the continent is changing. We're having a lot of influence coming from the East. We're having a lot of influence, the so-called influence from the West, which has been there for eons. And now we are in a situation where the whole entire region is becoming a battleground, for superpowers. So when Russia is present and America is present and China is finding its way into the region and France has been there, the only one who is not there is the African. And when the African is there, the African is there to suffer. The African is there to lose their lives, while most of these other guys come to fight for whatever they're looking for, which is always natural resources. Meanwhile, the African is the one who pays the price. So we have to be able to look at this from those perspectives if we will really be able to dive deep into what is happening.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. FONGOD. Of course, there are a lot of underlying factors as to why we have this insecurity that is persisting in the Sahel region of Africa. And it's not only at the level of international interference, like you mentioned earlier on. We have a whole lot of other factors we are talking of. Would you say that poverty could be one of the main causes of this insecurity that is continuing in that region of Africa?
Right, for sure. Whenever we talk about poverty, you have to also be able to look at two extremely important factors. Number one, weak governance and a lot of political instability. And you also have to look at environmental issues, especially with the vantage point of the Sahel. So if you're looking at poverty alone without understanding how weak governance and the political instability that we've had, which mostly starts with weak governance, and then, once a particular region or a particular country begin to experience weak governance, and this comes with the government's unable or with their inability to be able to tackle the issues of corruption, with their inability to be able to create a more fruitful environment where the private sector can flourish, with their inability to invest in infrastructural development that can absolutely help small to medium-sized enterprises to be able to flourish, while we are dealing with weak governments without the ability to be able to create an environment where a particular company in one country will have the capacity to sell their goods and services across the so-called international borders, which exist on the African continent, by therefore stunting their growth. And as a result of that, push us into an environment where we are not able to hire as much people into the job market because we can't create those jobs. We only hire people if the companies that are in existence grow, or if new players come into the economics, into the entrepreneurial scene, and then be able to create jobs. Once we have weak governance in those areas, then the small to medium-sized enterprises, which are always the highest people, or the most people, the company that hires the most people, they will absolutely not thrive. If that was going to be the case, it creates a particular tension that exists within, these countries, and then leading us into political instability. The flip side of, having a country that experiences a lot of political instability is that you will not have a lot of foreign investors who are coming into those countries to come and invest. And obviously, investors will want to go to a place that is more favorable in terms of its political stability, because they know that they're going to get their money back. They know that the money they invest will not be holed up. They know that there will not be in political stability where men and women will go out and just start burning up stuff and eventually burn out whatever their capital that they've invested in the country. That becomes an issue. And then when you start looking at that, it creates, it is a vicious circle that basically just throws the whole entire nation, into poverty. Now, this could have been okay, or at least, people can still be able to survive. We've seen this happen in other African countries where there is political instability, bad governance, but the people are still surviving because now we have food. Okay, if we look at some sub-Saharan African countries, despite the political instabilities we've had, despite the weak governance we've had, people have had food and they're still eating. That's not the case with the Sahel. They have this constant threat of the Sahara that keeps pushing south. That means they have very limited real estate in relationship to planting, and very few land for which is basically arable, so that they can be able to plant and harvest anything. And so they are fighting the Sahara that is encroaching from the north, which basically means that there's low hill, they are not producing as much crops as they can. They are fighting, the issues of weak governance, which is not providing for them the environment necessary for small to medium-sized enterprises to thrive, which is basically the private sector. And obviously they are fighting political instability, where men and women basically pick up arms and say, you know what, we're not going to stand for this, we're not going to die, we're going to do whatever it takes to be able to see ourselves delivered. So it is just a cocktail of issues, especially in the Sahel, and we have to begin to address even the issues of poverty, just from weak governance, political instabilities, and then try to see how we can be able to talk about the issues of climate change. And by the way, when I talk about climate change, I'm not a big proponent about the fact that the climate is changing. Once upon a time, the Sahara used to be vegetative. It used to be the savanna, all right? It used to be teeming with wildlife. It had a lot, with wildlife. The safari, was the whole entire Sahara. But now we have the desert. And so our ideas as to what the human factors are so far as, climate change is concerned, is a little bit stunted by data and the realities of the past. But I believe that we need to be able to protect the environment, but not at the expense of the quality of human life and its dignity. We must be able to protect the environment, yes, but we must do so in a more responsible manner, and there are ways for us to do that.
Right, Dr. Fongo, thank you so much. Of course, there are ways for us to do that. And you made mention of weak governance, and I think that's where we had the coup in Mali coming up, because the people of Mali thought at some point that the former president Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta had actually failed the people in providing for them the security they needed, especially with the Islamist insurgency that took hold of the part of the continent as from 2012. So we had the coup, and we have 3 countries in that part of the region who have detached themselves from the ECOWAS region. We are going to come to that later in the program. Now, let's first of all look at these terrorist groups that are taking hold of that region. We know these are one of the things that are continuing. We continue to see insecurity in the Sahel region of Africa. Now, how do you think these various armed groups or terrorist groups operate within the Sahel, and what are their motivations? Now, we have a UN official who spoke recently to the United Nations Security Council, and he was talking about the Daesh group of Afghanistan, and that if this group is not contained, it's going to continue to wreak havoc not only in Afghanistan, but then it's going to spread to other parts like the Sahel region of West Africa. What is your take on that?
I think that one of the greatest problems we have in the world will be the issues of terrorism, and it has to come, especially when it has to when we are dealing with Islamic, extremist groups. And unfortunately, it is the realities of the day. In the Sahel, we have Al-Qaeda. I think we have the Islamic Maheb. We have ISIS, of the Greater Sahara. We have a lot of other little tiny groups that are affiliated with ISIS, and some that are also still affiliated, with Al-Qaeda, that is wreaking extreme havoc in the region. The issue for me is this, that we have to be able to understand why these groups are absolutely doing what the groups are doing, and then who is funding. if you look clearly about all of this Islamic State, you need to be able to go back into the Middle East to find their funding structure. And unfortunately, we are so much interested, especially as Africans, demented in many ways. We act like people who have lost their minds, where we sit on the sidelines and we are clapping our hands and cheering and being in support either of Israel or either of the Palestinian state. The reason why I say so is because right now, as we speak, apart from the fact that we have this terrorist organization, which are clearly being sponsored from the Middle East, that are doing intense, that are bringing intense pain onto the scene in Sahel, they are absolutely not being, nobody is questioning who is funding these structures and why they are actually existing on the African continent. For some reason, it is okay. It is okay for the African to die, on the hands of people like ISIS and Al-Qaeda on the African continent, but it is not okay if any of these groups do launch attacks in places like the West. There will be intense war and pushback if that was going to happen. But on the African continent, it's okay. What I find extremely disturbing is the fact that even right to today, while we are trying to talk about the Palestinians and the Israelis issues, and then we push ourselves into the scene, for some strange reason, none of us is talking about the farms that is taking place in places like Libya, where in Libya, young migrants that are transiting from sub-Saharan Africa, heading out into Europe, going through the Sahara, through Libya, are being captured, put in farms where men rapes them, and then they will give birth to these children that are sold, in the black market. Nobody is talking about that. We still have black Africans that are sold in places, like northern Sudan, in places like Libya, in some areas of Algeria, and nobody is talking about that. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and these Islamic nations, they are benefiting from what is happening in these regions, and everybody is absolutely silent and quiet on it. But yet, when it comes to the issues of Palestine, when it comes to the issues, of Israel, the African is always the first, to be cheering. But the problem is we are starving the chickens at home and feeding the birds of the air. We are interested in stuff that absolutely has of no monetary value, no physical value, no ethnic value to who we are as a people. And yet we are the ones dying, on the continent, and nobody is saying anything. I think there is an old African adage that, you never cry more than the bereaved. I think the African is specialized, in this sense. We have to find ways to be able to deal, with ISIS and deal with all these Islamic states, that are operating on the continent of Africa in ways that is meaningful. That means we must be able to call out their sponsors. We must bring out their sponsors on the international scene. The African media must do whatever it takes to be able to push as much as it can the realities of the operations of these groups on the continent of Africa. We've seen what Boko Haram, which is just part of these groups, has done in Nigeria, in Cameroon. We have to be able to talk about this intensely, and we cannot shy. You can't be quiet. To be quiet means that you have absolutely accepted the status quo and you're willing to deal with its consequences. Unfortunately, you just can't. If you keep your mouth shut without talking intensely about what is going on, I guarantee you this madness will not stop. But unfortunately, in the Sahel, you've had different groups that have come into the Sahel in the name of trying to come and fight this insurgency that is taking place. America is there, France is there, Russia is there. They are not there because they are interested in Mali. They are not there because they're interested in the life of the Malian. No. They are not there because somehow the Nigerian, they're interested in those coming from Niger. No, they are in these regions primarily for what? Gold, mineral, and all that they can get, because obviously Africa is a place everybody can loot. And so if we're going to absolutely deal with the issues of insurgency, it is also important for us to understand that groups like the African Union needs to participate fully in making sure that they send peacekeeping force into these regions to be able to fight these groups without allowing foreign entities with interest in these regions to come in, because all they're doing is segmenting the regions, into quarters that they control, so that they can illegally mine and take out our resources with nobody questioning. That is what is going on. If we can keep a country at war long enough, then we can be able to rape the country in terms of our natural resources as long as the war is still in place. We have to stop this madness and allow the African to breathe.
Thank you very much, Dr. FONGOD. Of course, we have to address these issues that are continuing to give rise to the violence in the Sahel region of West Africa. Now, before we continue with our discussion, let's get this excerpt of the UN Under Secretary for Counterterrorism, Vladimir Voronkov, who actually addressed a United Nations Security Council meeting last week, talking about the current situation in the Sahel region and, of course, making mention of the Daesh terrorist group that needs to be looked into. Take a listen.
All of victims of terrorism as peace advocates. My office will continue to support member states in promoting survivor-centered, gender-sensitive, and human rights compliant approaches. Mr. President, Excellencies, unfortunately, the situation in parts of Africa has not improved since my last briefing. The terrorism landscape in West Africa and the Sahel remains challenging and complex. Terrorist groups continue to expand in the Sahel and inflict high casualties, undermining regional stability. Two of the Daesh affiliates in the region, the Islamic State West Africa province and the Islamic State in the Greater Sahel, have expanded and consolidated their areas of operations. Should these groups extend their influence in northern littoral states, a vast territory stretching from Mali to northern Nigeria could fall under their effective control. In other parts of the continent, Daesh affiliates have increased their operational pace in northern Mozambique, as well as in Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, where a dramatic increase in terrorist attacks resulted in high civilian fatalities. Also in Somalia, the Daesh affiliate has become stronger. Mr. President, Excellencies, two of the risks outlined in reports over the past years have regrettably become manifest since my last briefing. The first is the risk of ISIL-K, the Daesh affiliate in Afghanistan, carried out terrorist attacks abroad. ISIL-K has improved its financial and logistical capabilities in the past 6 months, including by tapping into Afghan and Central Asian diasporas for support. The group has also intensified its recruitment efforts.
That was Vladimir Voronkov, the UN Under-Secretary General for Counter-Terrorism, addressing the United Nations Security Council on the current security situation in the Sahel region of West Africa and how the Daesh terrorist group is continuing to expand in parts of Africa. Now, Dr. FONGOD, we just listened to Vladimir Voronkov and what he said about the region, that the situation right there is still very challenging, and is talking about this Daesh terrorist group expanding. He mentioned Somalia and other African countries. Now, when such reports are given to the United Nations Security Council, would you say that bodies like this actually act upon these situations immediately? And if it's that they don't take action immediately, what needs to be done so that situations like this can be addressed, especially in Africa, because we have seen over time that crisis in Africa are somewhat overlooked?
Well, I think I'll be, oh God, I might not be the right person to say this, but unfortunately, let me just break it to you that the life of the African is worthless so far as the United Nations is concerned. You see, the United Nations use Africa as a proxy. It use Africa as a prop on the international stage, just so to show a little bit of humanity so that each and every one of us can feel and think that the United Nations, wish Africa well. The United Nations was really never structured to be able to handle, sub-Saharan nations, especially when I talk about, Africa, those of us in sub-Saharan Africa. I don't think that the United Nations mandate had any interest so far as this particular bloc is concerned. The history of the United Nations so far as Africa is concerned is well catalogued. Is it their silence in places like Rwanda? Is it their silence in places like Sierra Leone? Is it their silence in places like Mogadishu? Would this be their silence in places like South Sudan? I mean, you can catalog, a lot of situations that have happened on the African continent where the United Nations has absolutely done nothing. And this gentleman's assertion as to how dire the situation is in the Sahel is absolutely, it's quite weak to say the least. It is worse than what it is. They are seven, pushing up to 9 different terrorist organizations that are operating in the Sahel. We have the Jamaat, that are operating in places like Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger. We have the Islamic State operating in Mali, is operating in Niger, is operating in Burkina Faso. We have the Arusna Islam. Those guys are primarily in Burkina Faso, and they're also affiliated with Al-Qaeda. You're talking about Boko Haram, Niger, Chad, Nigeria, Cameroon. You're talking about the Al-Qaeda of the Islamic Mahab. These guys are operating in Nigeria, they're operating in Mali, they're operating in Mauritania, they're operating in Niger, they're in Libya. All right. You're talking about groups like Katiba, Masina. These are operating in Mali, and they are affiliated with the Al-Qaeda. You're talking about the Islamic State of, the West African provinces. These are in Niger, they're operating in Cameroon, they're in Nigeria, they are in Chad. You're talking about groups like Marabotunis. These guys are operating in Mali, they're operating in Nigeria, they're operating in Libya, they're operating in I think a little bit part of that somewhere around Mali also. All right. And then you're talking about United Jihad, basically, which is of West Africa, which is, one of the worst of the worst. These guys are in Mali, they're in Niger, they're in Nigeria. Right. And so you're looking about 9 terrorist organizations that are operating in the Sahel. And we are talking about what? One? No. Each of these groups is as deadly as it gets. And unfortunately, we are quite silent about this on the continent of Africa. It's easy for us to blame the West. It's easy for us to blame the East for the insurgency. But there is one group that always gets silent. We need to be able to call out every Islamic state. We are talking about Qatar. We are talking about Turkey. We are talking about Saudi Arabia. We are talking about countries like Algeria. We are talking about countries like Morocco. These countries, we are talking about Egypt. We are talking about, Sudan, the Greater Sudan, North Sudan. We have to be able to call out these nations. They have to be able to answer to the issues of these groups on the continent of Africa and the havoc that they are creating, because we don't see this happening in their individual countries. But yet, from every single indications we have, they are the ones sponsoring the madness that is taking place on the African continent. Why we are at it, it is very important that we call on the African Union to stop being a puppet, all right, to stop being just a toothless bulldog on the continent of Africa, terrorizing different African nations, because they don't, get their marching orders from the West, and absolutely ask them to do what they were created to do. This is not the dreams of men like Kwame Nkrumah. This is not the dreams of people like Patrice Lumumba. These are not the dreams. The idea that the African Union can sit on the sideline and watch Africa burn is crazy. I mean, why are they in existence? Why is groups like ECOWAS more interested in toppling whatever is happening in Niger rather than focusing on being able to put an end as to what is happening in the Sahel? We are dealing, and obviously when you see those boys in the Sahel decide to form a federation because they absolutely can't take this stuff anymore, it is because we have groups like ECOWAS that is in the pocket of the West, and they will do whatever the West wants to be done. And it's such we are clear, if any foreign country will have to be able to come into the continent of Africa, let's say the United States of America, let's say France, let's say England, let's say Russia, let's say China, it will be important for them to come in under the pretense of peacekeeping. So if there is war, if there is something going on, and then these countries will just conveniently come in, oh, we are here because of the peacekeeping, let's take care of, whatever is going on. But geopolitically, they will never show up if there is no conflict. So it's it that most of these conflicts that we are facing is absolutely being engineered by, these so-called superpowers? Or why is it that we are more interested in bringing into the continent of Africa things that the African absolutely have no interest in? I'm talking about issues like the transgender issues. Meanwhile, most important issues that is affecting the African, like the war that is taking place in the DRC with 127 different militia groups, like what is taking place in the Sahel with more than 9 different terrorist organizations, span across 6 to 7 different countries. The whole entire world is silent. We have to be able to tackle the issues of this jihadist group in the Sahel from a unique perspective. They are Muslims that are Africans first. They are Muslims that are born Africans, Black Africans, people who have inhabited, whose ancestors inhabited the whole entire Sahel regions for thousands of years. These are men that needs to rise up and tell the world that this madness will not happen. When a young African align themselves with groups that have come to be able to bring some kind of a French idea, about Islam into their region, and they are willing to kill, they are willing to put the knife at someone's jugular just to be able to end their lives, that is no longer religion. And none of our religions on the African continent as Africans literally promoted us going around and putting the knives on anybody's throat in the name of the fact that they did not believe in what we believe in. This idea, this cancer needs to be stopped. This cancer needs to be yanked out. This cancer needs to be surgically, taken out, on the African scene. And I believe that African Muslims have a greater role to play in being able to stop this madness. I'm calling on the Muslims on the African continent to fully understand, that if care is not taken, all right, even they themselves will be at risk. Look at the place like Mali. Look at the place like Timbuktu. Ancient manuscripts held by Muslims, manuscripts that originated from the 7th century all the way to the 14th century. That's how old these manuscripts are. Manuscripts that were in the hands of men like Mansa Musa. Manuscripts that great intellectuals in places like Sankore University handled. Men who had great intellectual prowess, people who were so gifted that were running universities, one of the first in their days. Okay, people like Ahmed Baba. These are the people who were great custodians of this knowledge, but those books are absolutely being burned by uneducated, untrained, unqualified hoodlums, men with no two functioning brain cells who are moving on a French ideology that somewhat whatever they do, their God will be able to appreciate and give them 72 virgins. That is sickening. That is sickening. We're talking about artifacts, great artifacts that is to be preserved for future generations, to show the greatness of the African, to show the greatness of our forefathers as Africans. But that is being taken away from us, not because we want to, but because some French groups inspired from countries like Qatar, from countries like Afghanistan, from countries like Saudi Arabia, from countries like Iran, and all of those Islamic nations, to come into the continent and basically sabotage that which we are building. The Islamic community in Africa needs to be able to speak up. It's not for us to do, it's for them to be able to speak up against this madness and find a way to put an end to it. This, in my opinion, is not Islam.
Right, Dr. FONGOD, of course, our brothers have to understand that whatever is going wrong in the continent doesn't affect only those that are suffering from it right now, but it affects the entire continent, they themselves inclusive. Now, you made mention of the continental bloc, the African Union, as well as the regional bloc, ECOWAS, and the role they have played so far. Now, in your opinion, what do you think the African Union or the ECOWAS, or how well have they managed the situation in the Sahel region of West Africa, and what did you expect of them with this current insecurity that is taking hold of the region?
In my opinion, the ECOWAS does not exist. You probably might just be asking me, what is Washington, D.C. doing about it? Don't talk about ECOWAS. Who cares about ECOWAS? ECOWAS is nothing else but a puppet of the West. Everyone knows that. ECOWAS is absolutely incompetent, has no moral fiber, no strength, no fortitude to do anything. ECOWAS is a sick man. ECOWAS is an old, sick, senile individual. If I was going to describe ECOWAS as a person, ECOWAS is absolutely, ECOWAS is dimmed with no intelligence, no desire for the continent of Africa. ECOWAS is a puppet. It's a shame to even talk about ECOWAS. There's nothing ECOWAS is going to do. I don't even recognize them as anything. I think that they have proven to us in many ways that they are dancing to whatever Washington says, whatever is coming out of Paris, whatever London is interested in, that's what they would do. And based upon that, it is not even necessary nor important to bring them into any conversation that has to do with the African, especially in West Africa. West Africa was supposed to be a place of great hope. Look at countries like Nigeria, look at countries like Ghana, look at those, countries that were supposed to have given us the template for what is it that we're supposed to be, but they have become a testing ground for whatever stupid ideas are being pushed out of Washington, D.C., like the LGBT community, mandates, trying to push that stuff in places like Ghana. That's sickening. Who cares about ECOWAS? We should be talking about some other groups. Maybe you get me excited if we start talking about what those guys in the Sahel are doing. That's legitimate. When three countries basically says to themselves, you know what, no one is coming, no one is going to show up, the salvation of our continent is on our shores, we're going to take matters into our own hand, we're going to protect our people, protect our land, that's commendable. That's what we're talking about. To have young leaders with a vision, with a mindset to say, you know what, we want to create our own utopia on the African continent. We don't want our young men leaving these countries to go to the United States, to go over to Europe, to show up in places like Paris, just because they're trying to go and seek for greener pastures. We will build that greener pastures here on the continent, here in the Sahel region. That's recommendable. When you have a country like Niger, which once upon a time was at the bottom of all human economic index, basically stepping up to becoming the fastest growing country on the African continent and the 7th in the world, that's what we're talking about. So when you mention the Sahel, excuse me if I have to laugh, the Sahel is if you make ECOWAS rather, excuse me if I'm laughing about ECOWAS, ECOWAS is a joke. It's a joke. There's nothing to talk about, nothing to write home about.
Right, Dr. Fongod, I get your point. Now, I mentioned ECOWAS because lately ECOWAS mentioned that the withdrawal of Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali from the regional bloc is actually undermining the fight against terrorism or the fighting against insecurity. Now, we have the ECOWAS Commissioner for Political Affairs, Peace and Security in the person of Ambassador Abdel Fattah Musa, who actually made mention of this during the 42nd committee, the 42nd session of the Committee of Chiefs of Staff of the ECOWAS, who met in Abuja, Nigeria, from the 7th to the 9th of August, and he says that the withdrawal of, or he said that the withdrawal of these three countries from the bloc is going to lead to unintended security challenges. What can you say about that?
True. It would lead to dire situation in West Africa.
Dr. Fongod?
True. It would lead to situations that is absolutely unimaginable. True. That's a fact. There's nothing, wrong about what he said. Absolutely. As who's making ECOWAS? ECOWAS is the architect of the dismantling, of what is happening, in West Africa. If you look at the fears that I have, and a lot of experts in these areas do have, is the fact that you want to have, a spillover, because maybe the boys in the Sahel might not be able to handle the pressure coming in, from this terrorist organization, and there will be, a south migration of these into places like Ghana, deep into places like Nigeria, into places like Togo. All right. So we have to, Cameroon for that matter, and the list goes on. We have to find a way to make something work. But just like I said, the unfortunate situation is you have Washington, D.C. running the ECOWAS. That's the problem. You have France running the ECOWAS. That's the problem. And in that light, the interest of the West will always trump the interest of the African. And that, unfortunately, is the African story for the last 6 decades. That is something I don't understand. That's something I absolutely do not stand for. And all I'm saying is this: we will have to dismantle the ECOWAS, and the only way to do so is to elect the right people in power in these individual nations and let those bureaucrats, and by the way, bureaucrats, people who are absolutely not even elected in their own individual nations, should have absolutely no say when it comes to the security of the region. I'm talking about these bureaucrats, men who were hired, okay, who were recommended by the United Nations, recommended by America, highly recommended by France to come and serve, in some capacity, in ECOWAS. Obviously, these are men who are planted by foreign powers to be able to tell, this dimwit in the name of hero states who absolutely have no two functioning brain cells as to what is happening in the region to do the beatings of these foreign groups. We have to be able to make sure that some major key positions that are in these regions are electable. These are people that are not hired. These are people who are elected primarily by, maybe set up the structures where those in West Africa will have to go in a West African bloc kind of an election to make sure that the people we want are in those areas of authority. That's the only way I see this working.
Right, Dr. Fongod. Now, looking at the ECOWAS and what it takes and how it has been functioning, especially when it comes to crisis in the different member states of the bloc and how the bloc has been handling this crisis. Now, would you say that the ECOWAS should be completely dissolved, or there should be some reforms that occur in that regional bloc?
Well, if I say we should dissolve the ECOWAS, I must be very young. I think that we have to be able to make sure that the ECOWAS is not dissolved. We have to do major reforms, and I don't even know how we take care of those major reforms, how be it that we are able to elect, because you have to start from head of state. See, the ECOWAS is a combination of head of state. When you have these dinosaurs that are leading our countries, when you have these men who have been placed there by the West, when you have these individuals who are not interested in the African first. They're interested in drinking tea in places like Paris, in places like, Washington, D.C. They're interested in having photos, taking pictures with, with presidents like, presidents like those of America, France, and, you name it. Then you are dealing with a bunch of people who are absolutely doing whatever the West wants them to do. These are men who have no vision for Africa. So let us begin by making sure that whoever, you see, most countries do not understand this. Most citizens in the West African bloc and on the continent of Africa do not even get this picture. If we elect, right, if we bring into power Pan-Africans, men who think Africa first, then all of these issues will disappear overnight. You will not need to do anything else, because you cannot be able to tackle the issues of Africa not by allowing these other countries in the African continents to be invaded, by French groups coming in from God knows where, jihadist Islamic groups. You will be able to fight that cancer out of the continent and basically dismantle the structure and put Africa's mind and bring some kind of an Africa first agenda. This continent called Africa must have citizens who believe that Africans are responsible for Africa, Africans at home and Africans abroad, in the words of Marcus Garvey. We have to be able to have that, this vision, this passion for Africa. So let's elect people who are Pan-Africans to handle these issues in the first place. Not bringing, dinosaurs to come and sit in places of power. They don't know where they are. They don't know what's going on. They're just sitting there. And then whatever Washington says, they say, yes, sir, we're going to do it for you. Everything is all right, and all this garbage. Let's handle the issues of Africa from an Afrocentric perspective.
Right, Dr. FONGOD, and I believe countries like Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso have already understood that assignment. Now, how do we get the entire continent to understand that in order to get a continent that is thriving, we need to get leaders that are there to fight for the people and not for their own personal interest? I think it begins from educating Africans. How do we go about that? How do we get Africans to believe that if we have to get our continent running and get our continent at the top, we have to bring in the right leaders, and not just because, or not just that we have to follow the crowd and do what maybe the West wants. How do we educate Africans now to take on this very pertinent issue?
Well, the most important thing that we need to do so far as the continent is concerned is to educate the African in understanding that we will have to have a robust military structure on the continent of Africa. That military structure has to be so powerful that it will be able to fend off every invader. It will be able to fend off every foreign military groups or present on the continent of Africa, and liberate the continent, sanitize the continent from every foreign intervention. The way we do that is to be able to elect people with the vision of a Pan-African, where we are able to bring our individual forces together from different countries, just how the African Union would do, but bring them with the Pan-African mindset to make sure that they understand that the only reason why they are there in this region is to fight off the invaders, not to fight another African. You see, the problem with us in Africa is we are busy fighting one another. We have created these ideas on the African continent that another African is your enemy. We have created this sick idea that another black person is the person who does not want you to succeed. For some strange reason, we are the only people in the world who believe this mad ideology. No, the problem is we have segmented ourselves into groups and factions so that different foreign entities have come and taken over the minds of different factions, and so we are thinking differently and we are fighting one another, not knowing that we are the same people. Look at the country like Cameroon. Why is there an issue between the Anglophones and the Francophones? Obviously, it's based upon ideological lines. One is Anglo-Saxon, and the other person is a Francophone. It's a French person, right? And another person is an Anglo person. One person takes tea in the morning, and another person is drinking milk and bread and eat breads with every single thing else. That's what we have basically inherited, from our colonial masters, France. And the English guy is drinking tea because obviously he inherited that from their colonial masters, the British. And so we are sitting over here and we are killing one another because another person is French speaking, another person is English speaking. If you understand, and vice versa, so we treat one another on those bases like I'm far more civilized, I'm far more better than you, and you are far more better than me. No, man, no, you are not. You're eating cassava just like me. Your ancestors own this land just as us. Just a couple of years ago, you were taught to speak English and I was taught to speak French. That doesn't mean that we are separate people. We are the same people, but just being manipulated and controlled by two separate ideas that are not even African. And then we are fighting one another on those bases. We have to be able to elect leaders on the continent of Africa that understand this dynamic, that will be able to push Africans to understand the Afrocentric nature of who we are as a people, that we have languages on the continent of Africa that needs to become our official languages, not English. That we should be able to speak a language that's uniquely us as Africans, not that we come out and we are trying to be able to think in our traditional languages and then before we try to spew out whatever it is that we're trying to say in the English language, to which it is that we hardly will be able to communicate as effectively as if we were speaking what is natural to us. Maybe if we elect leaders on the continent of Africa that has this mindset, that are Afrocentric in nature, that are Pan-Africans to say the least, men who would lift up Africa rather than bring it down, people who would see the utopia that Africa can be, men who will be able to build a Dubai on the continent of Africa, who will be able to create a thriving, robust middle class by bringing in factories just as what China is doing, men who will be able to think about nuclear power on the continent of Africa, people who will start thinking about the abilities that we do have on the continent in terms of leveraging our natural resources in such a way that it boosts our economy, gives us the funding we need to be able to build our infrastructures and help the continent thrive. Those are the kind of leaders we need to be elected, not the individual who will give you money like it happens in Nigeria so that you can vote for them. You must be demented. You must be, I think it's a cycle. I don't know exactly what to say, that somebody comes and gives you a naira today to vote for them. And then what happens tomorrow? What happens the day after? What happens a month from now? Absolutely nothing. Elect people to power with a vision, not with a bank account. Men with a vision. A country will change because of her vision. It will never change because of what the person who you're electing into the place of power, because of the size of their pocket. You are missing the point. Get someone who has a vision, not just for your individual nations, but a vision for the continent. If that was going to be the case, prosperity will become not just a byword on the African continent, it will be a thriving word on the African continent. Security will be absolutely something we can handle, because then we will have all these other forces, all these nations bringing their forces together so that we can literally sanitize areas like the Sahel and take out every jihadist group, basically whip them out on the continent, destroy, blow them out into smithereens and allow the continent to breathe. I think time has come for the continent of Africa to take her place, among the greats of the world and allow Africa to emerge. Young Africans, we are having a very thriving young population on the African continent who are in need of work, and all of these supposed to just bring us together, to a place where we have a thriving workforce and allow the African to explore their full potential, not stunting us with all these political stunts coming in from places like Washington, D.C. and the rest of the West, or even from Russia for that matter. Let's allow the African to be instrumental in shaping and building her future. The salvation of the continent will be in the hands of the African and nobody else.
Of course, Dr. FONGOD, the salvation of Africa is in the hands of all Africans, and Africans have to understand that they are one another's keeper, and not an Africa where we see countries going through elections and the opposition always crying foul that there was rigging and so forth. We want an Africa like Rwanda, where even after elections, the opposition had to come out, or still came out and accepted the election results and set the results, or the election was well conducted. That the kind of Africa that we are vying for, being one another's keeper. Now let's continue to take a look at this Sahel region of Africa and the insecurity. Now, let's talk a little more about the three countries that withdrew from the ECOWAS bloc of nations. That's Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, and they have actually created or formed their own confederation. That's the Confederation of Sahelian States, known by its French acronym AES. Now, these countries, they actually left the bloc earlier this year, and now in March they talked of creating a joint force, force to tackle the security threats in the region. Now, what do you think about this? If Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso come together to create a force to fight insecurity in the region, do you see that, or do you see that growing into something that may, at some point, actually curb this insecurity that we are seeing in the Sahel region of West Africa?
Absolutely. I think that it will absolutely help us and help, the region. And the reason for that is because obviously if you look at countries like Mali, if you look at Burkina Faso, you look at Niger, they have had all their issues with either Islamic State, Al-Qaeda. It's been just a buffet, of insurgency that has been happening in these regions. And individually, it's been very difficult, for them to be able to do anything, especially in places like Mali, Timbuktu, and other areas in Mali has been burning for years. What we need is to actually get these nations to put their forces together and let these forces basically go in country to country, regions to region, and literally weed out all of these terrorist groups and just basically put an end to it, contain them in a particular area, and just destroy, this level of insurgency. It is extremely very important. All we are saying is this: if anybody wants to do anything, let it not be on the continent of Africa. Take this to your country. Take this to wherever you're coming from. We've had a lot of issues on this continent, and we don't want that stuff. But Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, they are doing the right stuff. As individual countries, it's quite difficult because you have to start dealing with the issues of intelligence sharing. So if you have a country like Mali that is facing an influx of these groups coming in, because most of them actually come in deep in the Sahara, to carry out these attacks and then go back into the Sahara, it's good to be able to make sure that these countries can put their resources together and be able to do some kind of, either human intelligence or, intelligence based on technology, with drones and God knows everything else that they have at their disposal, to be able to make sure that they identify these groups long before they inflict havoc, on innocent civilians. And while this is also taking place, I also hope that these countries will be able to also educate, because part of the issues in the Sahel is that you have local tribesmen, especially those who deal with the main form of business is railing cattle, that has to basically move around looking for greener pastures. The unfortunate thing is the whole entire area is so dry that most often at times they go into somebody's farm and they just basically raise the whole damn thing to the floor, and which is basically not acceptable. So, and that is part of the reasons why you have so much conflicts in the first place that is being capitalized on by these jihadist groups. We have to be able to sanitize and help and educate the young African in the Sahel about, what is going on and why it is important for us to live together as a unit. And this is where these individual governments must be able to come in to create, grazing areas, to be able to create and bring a lot of technology when it comes to animal husbandry and farming for that matter, so that these conflicts basically do not exist. And when these conflicts do not exist, most of these jihadist groups will have no reason to be able to recruit anybody with their French ideas. And if that was going to be the case, then the whole entire region will cease from becoming, a breeding ground for these terrorist groups. But we have to be able to make sure that there's a lot of education, there's a lot of investment in terms of agriculture in this region, and obviously sharing of intelligence, having one force with the capacity to quickly move in and quickly break out and quickly destroy, any terrorist group would be a plus. So what I think Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, they're doing an excellent job in that front.
All right, Dr. FONGOD. And would you say that the region, ever since these three countries came together to form that confederation or that bloc of the three states looking out for each other, would you say that the security situation in their respective countries has witnessed and some sort of improvement?
It's a net plus. It's a net plus. I think we can be able to say that that's a net plus, and obviously it's boosted the morals of the soldiers that they have, it's boosted the morals of the citizens. Now they fully understand that it's one bloc, it's basically, one federation, and they are no longer looking themselves as Malians, folks from Burkina Faso or Nigerians, but they are looking themselves as Africans, in the Sahel. So I think it's a net plus, and you can actually look at, the amount of terrorist attacks that has been taking place in these nations. It's actually gone down. It's not gone up. I think that's what the statistics says. So it's a net plus so far as I'm concerned.
Thank you so much, Dr. FONGOD. Now we have a few more minutes to be together. And earlier on in our introduction, I made mention of an attack that took place in Mali last month, where some Russian instructors were killed alongside Malian soldiers. And after that, we have some Islamic State groups, or some groups that came up to actually say that they carried out that attack. And since we're talking about the hidden forces behind this unending insecurity in the Sahel region, there's actually a group from the Ukraine intelligence group that actually the Ukraine military intelligence agency that actually claimed it was involved in the ambush that killed the Russian fighters. Would you say that Africa is being used as a playground for these world powers to continue to fight against each other? And how can the continent actually stay away from this?
Well, when the African realizes that everyone who has ever shown up on the continent of Africa with foreign aid did not come to help, when the African realizes that whenever Air Force Ones lands anywhere on the continent of Africa is not on goodwill, when the African realizes that any Caucasian that shows up on the continent of Africa, it did not come to the continent of Africa because they were really interested in helping the African, and that the salvation of the continent in itself has nothing to do with any foreigner, or with any slaver or a descendant of a slaver, that the salvation of the continent is going to be in the hands of other Africans. There is nothing to be said about it. Obviously, if you were ever going to think about Russian forces being killed on the continent of Africa, you also must be on the assumptions that the United States of America was highly involved in it. Forget about whatever those boys in Russia, in Ukraine are talking about. So, and the reasons for that is because, it's a geopolitical battle right now for Africa. And Russia is coming in, and of which I don't think that we are sitting here on the sidelines and throwing our hands and says, Kumbaya, let Russia comes in. We have learned a lot from the West. We have learned a lot from America. We have learned a lot from those in Europe, that we are smart enough to understand that these things never ends well. All we are saying is take your fight out of the continent. You can fight each other, but let Africa not become the ground to which it is that this madness is taking place. What that means is we must be able to have lawyers on the African continent with a little bit of spine to be able to take these issues to the United Nations. How be it symbolic, we need to be able to do that. We must be able to have news organizations on the African continent that is able, willing to be able to call out this madness the way it is. We need to be able to do that. Unfortunately, most of us are we are chickens hiding in cages in the name of being journalists and absolutely saying nothing and doing nothing, maybe because we are too ignorant as to what is going on, or we just have the spine to be able to speak up. The continent does not need weak men. The continent needs men who can stand up, men who will stand up when they need to stand up, men who has the capacity to speak, women who are not too scared to be able to look at in the face of reality and say exactly what is it that they're saying. The Africans need their daughters and their sons to be able to stand up to this aggression that is taking place on the African continent. Proxy wars should not be fought in Africa. We are not interested. We are interested in the development of this continent, not that the continent should become a playground, for those boys, in the West and in the East. It's not for Africa. We have our own issues, and don't bring your issues here at home. And this is the problem that most of our leaders do not get. For some reason, you have this feeling that because you align yourself with the West, you're secure. You are not secure. You are never secure. If you think I'm joking, look at a country like Bangladesh. All right? Nobody is secure. Just because you align yourself to any foreign power does not mean that you're secure. When the people rises, when the people step up and says this madness must stop, look at a place like Kenya. It does. So the idea that somewhat, you're secure because you're aligning yourself to the West, those days are over. They're over. Now you need to align yourself with the people. You need to align yourself with the citizens of your countries, not with foreign entities. End of story.
Right, Dr. FONGOD, thank you very much. And as we move out of the program, what do you think is the way out of this insecurity? What is the way forward? What does the Sahel region of West Africa, or leaders who are in this part of the continent, or the continent as a whole, what does the continent need to do to be able to wipe out, or if not at all wipe out, to bring down this level of insecurity in the Sahel region? What does the continent need to do? What is the way forward?
We need to be able to disincentivize the reasons why young people are being recruited into these groups by creating a robust environment where the private sector can thrive, where young men can be able to have jobs, where the public sector, which is always the government, is able to create the environments for the private sector to literally, be able to have the kind of funding that they need, and thrive. We need to create an environment in these countries where foreign investors can be able to come in, bring the money that they have, and then be able to participate, in the market. And then we have to be able to fight the issues of corruption. I think it is extremely very important that individuals in these nations and citizens of these nations must be able to understand that the country, basically the government is treating them fairly, and that there are no elements in the government that are just looting the nation and doing whatever they want to do, but that there is some kind of an equity so far as the distribution of natural resources is concerned. I think every young African, demands that, and they need to be able to see that. We need to be able to create and build structures on the African continent that will allow young Africans to be employed and work for foreign organizations, and how be it, building robust infrastructures in the area of telecommunications. We need to be able to do all of this. We need to be able to give the African a reason why they have to leave. I think that once we have painted a picture so beautiful, so brilliant, so wonderful, that the young African begins to see the greatness and the beauty of their lives, where they are looking at their tomorrow, and they can be able to envision a tomorrow that is so beautiful, rather than a dismal tomorrow, which is the mirror image of where they have been, where they're from, where their fathers grew up, but rather a tomorrow that is so great, a tomorrow that will basically make any other areas around the world, places like Dubai, look like some nursery school, playground. A tomorrow with all that we have, with our minerals, working for us, infrastructural development in its place, and Africa becomes a tourist destination, okay, where tourists from different part of the world will come just to enjoy our beauty, okay, not just because they're coming for the safari, but to sit by, places like Limbe, places like Nigeria, places like East Legon in Ghana, and just enjoy the beauty, of what Africans have to offer. Once the African has that in the mind, it will be very difficult to recruit any African to go and die for a utopia they hope for, rather than believing in one that they see. Let's create what the African can see, and then all these people recruiting young Africans around the world will stop. That's the vision I have for Africa, and I hope that, I sold that well.
Thank you very much, Dr. FONGOD. Of course, Africa is supposed to be that place where the youth are able to see that they can strive, and it starts with good governance. As long as there's good governance, the youth will be able to get jobs, and everything is going to fall in place. So thank you so much, Dr. FONGOD, for taking our time to be with us this day on the program. We had Dr. Stanley FONGOD, Pan-Africanist, who joined us in the conversation this day on Talking Point. Thank you so much for your time once again. And it is on that note, televiewers, that we come to the end of this edition of Talking Point. We have been debating, or we have been exploring ways in which we can see the insecurity in the Sahel region come to an end, so that people in that part of the continent can also live normal lives. Thank you so much for always taking our time to be with us. Do not miss out on our next edition. Until then, it's bye-bye for now.